Hello and welcome back to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. Today, Aidan and I are going to be doing a part 2 rapid fire of our thoughts on 5 current diet trends. Now, you guys loved part 1, so we thought we'd give you a part 2. We're going to start with low inflammation diets. Now, the low inflammation diets that have been popping up for me on my feed are all largely focused on cutting out certain foods, or in some cases, a lot of foods. There was one particular video that came up for me and it's actually so ridiculous. This lady was saying, no dairy, no gluten, no processed meats, no caffeine, no sweeteners, no alcohol, no iodized salt, no honey, no beef, no shellfish, no nuts and seeds. That was just probably like 1/10 of her list. And it went on and on. So my thoughts are then like, generally, what is left? And this is not how I like to think about inflammation. So I'm going to get Aidan's thoughts and then we'll chat about my thoughts on this.
Yeah, similar kind of camp where obviously a lot of it is focused on like what to avoid. I'm just a positive guy. I take a positive lens on a lot of things, right? I do see negatives. If we're going to look at pros and cons, I see negatives when blanket statements are put out there. Common ones that I see are gluten-free, dairy-free and sugar-free, and making it seem like doing that is the move for everybody. So the sugar one I think is nuanced and it depends on the positivity lens that I have to the world. But the evidence absolutely does not, it doesn't support the gluten-free and dairy-free side of things being pro-inflammatory for the majority of people without context. That's not saying it's not pro-inflammatory for anybody. Of course it is, right? But there are blanket statements like, say, avoid these things for inflammation when, that's not what the research supports. If you did want an evidence-based kind of look from a population level, because individual stuff is a bit individual, right? The closest one I'm aware of is a thing called the Dietary Inflammatory Index. Have you seen this before?
I have, yes. And it gives every nutrient a score, based on whether it tends to increase inflammatory markers or lower them. So pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, or foods that sit somewhat in the middle.
Yeah, and it's based on over 2,000 studies, just looking at how the dietary components affect inflammation and looking at individual markers. This is a common thing in the evidence-based world when people are talking about inflammation, like how are you measuring that? And a lot of people will point to kind of things like they might say like swelling or puffiness or pain or like whatever. But there are markers we can use to measure inflammation. So CRP is one of them. There's a bunch of different interleukin factors that we can measure. And then there's TNF alpha as well. And the dietary inflammatory score is based on those markers. Going deeper on that, among the list of most anti-inflammatory foods that are on this list, we've got fatty fish like salmon, nuts, berries, ginger, leafy green vegetables, green tea, turmeric, tomatoes, extra virgin olive oil, dark chocolate, antioxidants, and just fiber in general as well. A lot of those things are non-controversial. Possibly the only controversial one on that list is tomatoes, because if there's some anti-nightshade vegetables that nightshade kind of approaches that put that into an inflammatory kind of category. Everything else is in most cases not controversial. I think you were saying off air in that list, seeds was on that list.
Yeah, no nuts and seeds, and then just things like iodized salt and, just very specific things that were supposedly causing this inflammation. So
this is one of the only contradictions from this list versus that list, right? Amongst the most pro-inflammatory stuff, we've got processed meats, sugar-sweetened beverages, refined grains, fried foods, foods high in saturated fat, trans fat, high sodium foods, and alcohol. And that's where some of that stuff is once again non-controversial. I think one of the few non-controversial things in the nutrition world is no one's out here saying eat more trans fats. It's one of the things we've got left. Some of it could get a bit more specific about being should people be avoiding refined grains, so on and so forth. But that's what the list has come to.
And I think if you're listening and you would like to support a reduction in inflammation, a great place to start is eating a whole food diet, which cuts out a lot of those, like you just mentioned, high inflammatory foods on the list. Focus on what you can add in. Focus on adding in those anti-inflammatory foods instead. Fatty fish, chia seeds, walnuts, leafy greens, all of those things, rather than excluding every food ever. Should we move on to the next one then?
Absolutely. Let's go controversial. On the next one, we've got seed oils.
This kind of feeds into a similar sort of trend. And for me, it's just completely swung, completely out of proportion on the fear-mongering that people have online with seed oils.
I've previously been on record saying that I think the average person consumes seed oils too much. The main stat I point to with that is that apparently 7 to 8% of calories consumed in the US come from seed oils. Not normally one to use US-based stats. It's just those are the only stats I've got, so that's why I'm going with it. And if I was going to go through my more neutral lens, which is how I look at a lot of things, the minimum thing I'd say is it's still a high-calorie oil that happens to be low in micronutrients, because if it has been refined that much, which most seed oils have, you can have unrefined seed oils. It's possible. It's just if you're looking at what are the people on average consuming? And if we're looking at that 7 to 8% of calories, like the majority is coming from like mostly processed seed oils. I can see logic in some of the criticisms in relation to how they're made, but when looking at outcomes, a lot of the problems they're linked to don't often show up. They're not linked with inflammation in research. They aren't increasing the risk of CVD that much in research either. I say that much because there's some caveats. Like if you do go down some rabbit holes, you can find some links. If you look at more broader research, there isn't a link. The omega-3 to omega-6 ratio doesn't seem to be important because if you're looking at it through the lens of refined seed oils, you will find a link. If you look at it through the lens of getting it from nuts and seeds, you don't find a link. And that therefore makes it seem, is this about the omega-6 versus omega-3, or is this other kind of ratios? And I also think it's just worth getting more omega-3s. If we were to have like a practical takeaway, I think we're on the same page where it's like, I don't think avoiding them completely is necessary. I just think a lot of people should potentially reduce their intake, and just doing that more whole foods diet is naturally going to lead in that direction too.
Yeah, I honestly don't think I have much to add there, but there has been studies that when they replace saturated fat, that's naturally going to cause a lower cardiovascular disease risk. So in that sense, potentially it is a better option than things like butter, saturated fats, plant oil, like that sort of thing. In terms of cardiometabolic health, am I saying go out of your way to add them in? Absolutely not. I'm very much on the same page with you there that maybe we consume too many, but do we need to be checking food labels for very minute amounts? Probably also not.
Yeah, and then if you want even more nuance in there, like flaxseed oil is technically a seed oil, and in its unrefined or like minimally processed state is linked with a lot of positive health outcomes. So like once again, like blanket statements could be an issue there too. Okay, protein sparing modified fast. I don't know if you've been in that world. You don't see this often?
Not so much. I'd actually written down like this is not something that pops up for me or in my recent trends, but yeah. Take it away.
So the idea of a protein sparing modified fast is that it's an extreme, short-term, very low-calorie diet that's designed to maximize fat loss while minimizing muscle loss, right? You can see the appeal of it because it's like you get all the benefits of fasting without losing muscle. The core features are high protein, usually around 1.5 to 2.5 grams per kilo. 2.5 is quite high, but the sole reason for not going anything above that is because it's still contributing calories. Very low calories, obviously, so often around 600 to 800 calories, depending on size. And this is just scaling based on the total amount of protein. Like almost all of that's coming from protein. Minimal carbs, minimal fat, just enough to avoid like essential fat acid like deficiency and keep micronutrients as adequate as you can on that tiny amount of calories. And then vegetables are allowed, ideally just only low calorie ones, high volume for a bit more satiation, but then fiber and micronutrients. And then supplementation can be beneficial, like electrolytes and stuff like that as well. I've got thoughts. You got thoughts?
Let me give a little bit of background. I had a look at a study, and I haven't got the name, so I'll link it in the show notes below. But they had 12 subjects who did this, and honestly, I don't know if I was blown away by the results. So they had them eat less than 20 grams of carbs. It was 1.5 grams per kilo protein, and then it was just whatever fat was in the meat is what they could have, along with some supplementation of essential vitamins and minerals. So most people lost about 10% of body weight in 3 months, which initially I'm like, wow, that's pretty impressive. That's great. And then they followed them on for another 3 months after that, and there was barely any further weight shift after. So seemed to be easy enough for 3 months to follow to. And then after that, clearly it's just very restrictive, hard to stick to. And a lot of clients didn't actually end up doing that shift from increasing calories again slowly. So this is not something I would recommend. And I think the fact that we normally in a deficit would probably push protein a little bit higher than that if we're wanting to preserve muscle mass anyway, for me, it's probably a no.
Yeah. And interesting that they did 3 months. Like 3 months is a long time to do something this aggressive. Weldon, which I've seen this more, is people more in the kind of like recreational bodybuilding world and stuff like that. It's kind of a subcategory of that where it's like people who just like lifting and maybe haven't like been super like dialed in on diet and stuff like that. But then they have an event, like they have a wedding or they have like whatever, and it might be like 4 to 8 weeks away or something like that. If I was going to go through pros and cons, like really effective for fat loss, technically it's like the borderline the quickest you can lose body fat. And I'd also much rather this over fully fasting because you can do some things like preserve a bit more muscle mass, so on and so forth. So like if you had like 4 weeks or whatever, theoretically there's a world in which this could potentially make sense. The muscle retention is surprisingly good if people still keep training hard, if they still keep lifting, which is incredibly hard to do on that low calories.
That was going to be my question. Like, is it impacting your training if you're someone who is a bodybuilder who is doing this? You haven't got much energy on that small amount of carbs either. I guess the idea is with this, we didn't mention that at the start, but it's that you switch into ketosis to use fat as fuel.
Yeah, absolutely. And you would 100%. I think if somebody's like a psychopath and they're just willing to train hard regardless of how they feel, their performance would still be impacted, but like they would be able to like help retain muscle like surprisingly effectively. Big thing here, should not be done long term. That's obvious for a few reasons. It's obviously going to be inadequate in a lot of areas. Like even if we just go back to micronutrients, if somebody's not using a multivitamin or anything like that, even if you are, like, are you missing polyphenols and stuff like that? Like there's even stuff that you're very likely to miss regardless. It's going to be inadequate in other like forms of fiber and stuff like that, impacts on gut health and stuff like that. And it does tend to be unsustainable. I've rarely seen people do this and then go on to have good progress long term. I've seen people do this phase well. It's just that nearly 100% of them have struggled longer term. There was a bit of a push in the evidence-based community a little bit, like maybe a year or two ago, maybe 2 years, where I was seeing like aggressive diets gain a bit more traction. And even amongst the people promoting that, I've seen a lot of them still struggle with their own nutrition after. It's like they were in a certain position before this where they would benefit from that. They did it. And then like a year later, they're back at like the same position. And it's possible to transition out of this well. It just seems rare.
Yeah. I think we're both on the same page there. Let's move on to the next one then. So calorie cycling. It's funny how we've ordered these. It actually kind of flows into the next. So this is a flexible dieting strategy where you alternate between higher and lower calorie days rather than eating the same amount of food each day within a deficit. So that could look something like having a calorie deficit 5 to 6 days a week and then either going back to maintenance or a slight surplus on a refeed or higher intake day. Potentially you just have different calories on different days based on training needs, so more calories around training, less on rest days, or you just have more calories on certain days for food flexibility. So 5 days in a deficit, 2 days on the weekend, you might have a bit more calories to play with.
Pros and cons, as always. Like I see a world in which this can work well. Let's start with like the positives. So like everything you just said is absolutely a positive. And something that really drove this home for me is there's a gym challenge that I work with. I still work with to this day, and it's been a long time. It's been a good relationship. But they do have people track calories, and they had a bit of a calculator. It's like if you took away 50 calories per day, keeping protein the same, so it's just coming from carbs and fats, it barely reduced carbs and fats. It wasn't a big deal. It would give people 300 calories extra on a Saturday. You took away 100 calories, you give them 600 extra on a Saturday. And the challengers loved that. You can see how it works well.
It makes sticking to a deficit more sustainable. And this is actually one of the reasons I do recommend it occasionally for clients. If they've voiced concerns of sticking to certain things on a weekend, why don't we just factor it in rather than that just ending up being 600 or 300 calories over deficit anyway? Why don't we just factor it in? And
something that I don't know how much this comes across in my content, because I do talk about calories a lot. Everything I say about calories applies whether you're tracking them or not. Like you literally could just eat a tiny bit more on weekends, and it's calorie cycling. Like it's not like precise, but it is calorie cycling. And it's like a lot of people will naturally do this. That can be done in a very positive way. It falls apart at extremes though. So if somebody, for example, ate heaps more on Saturday, or they eat heaps more on Saturday and Sunday and Friday evening, and then they try to balance it out, it would lead to underfueling on certain days. The more extreme you go, the more severe the underfueling is and the more days it requires or whatever. And typically the high calorie days aren't the most nutrient rich days. It doesn't usually scale proportionally. Like usually there's other reasons it's higher calorie. So it ends up reducing the overall nutritional quality of the diet as well if you go down that route.
And just generally, if you're doing it for fat loss, exactly, calories in, calories out is what's going to matter more. So this is more an option if that's going to work better for you. I'm pretty neutral on it.
Yeah. I didn't flag this at the start, but obviously these aren't super rapid fire answers. Like I looked at my notes and I was like, this is not going to be rapid fire, but that's fine.
Oh, good.
We've got one more. We're going to talk about stable blood glucose levels and trends associated with that.
Before we dive into what we've been seeing as the trend, I want one thing to note. So for most healthy people, obsessing over this perfectly flat, balanced blood sugar isn't necessary because it naturally does rise and fall after eating meals. The focus often should be more on supporting overall metabolic health rather than eliminating these spikes. But the trend that we're talking about is where people are looking at stabilising every single little spike.
And how a lot of people have promoted doing this is things like vinegar or apple cider vinegar either works equally well pre-meal. Doing things with meal order, for example, going like vegetables, then protein, then carbs. Walking after meals, and then just anything else that helps to quote unquote like flatten the curve. So we can go through one by one. Let's start with like vinegar. So vinegar pre-meals, that has good evidence for reducing blood glucose levels. In my notes, I've put a little question. It's like, it doesn't matter. Like, doesn't matter. Like,
in those with insulin resistance, potentially. Yeah.
Yeah, and like that, like for somebody with diabetes, I can see benefit. I actually have somebody with diabetes right now who I'm using it with, so it's like I go out of my way to use this with certain people. I don't do that with everybody with diabetes. You just got to take like a specific type of person for me to want to go down this route. I've put something in brackets that like mechanisms are too complicated for podcasts. Like I wrote down all the mechanisms. Like no one wants to hear this. If you do, message me on Instagram or Google it yourself. But it's also pretty short term, like the reduction in like glucose levels due to this. And it's some studies have concluded it's not clinically meaningful, even in diabetes. Like it's just a small reduction. And if you didn't enjoy doing this, I think there's other ways you can use your willpower that would have more effect. But it's the most evidence-backed one, or it is evidence-backed. I suppose all of these things technically are evidence-backed. Do you want to talk to the next one?
Yeah, let's go for it. So meal order. Now the claims here are that when you eat your veggies first, it forms a barrier of fibre in the gut, which can reduce blood sugar spikes. Now fibre and protein do slow gastric emptying, which can reduce the rate of the digestion of carbohydrates, potentially reducing the spike. Again, is it something that we need to be concerned about? Potentially, if you've got like type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, that sort of thing. Otherwise, is the spike necessarily a bad thing if your body can respond to it naturally? That's sort of how I sit with that one.
Yeah, so it's another like slight reduction. And another one is walking after meals. So genuinely, it is a solid idea if it's feasible and very easy for you to do. It helps burn through some of the glucose that's coming in and shuttle some of that into the muscles as well. But it also depends on how much glucose matters to you, which leads us back to kind of what you were saying earlier, where it's like the whole idea of like flattening the curve isn't super relevant for a lot of people. From a body composition perspective, it doesn't matter. We have very clear evidence on that. There's a deep rabbit hole you can go down to conclude that it doesn't matter. From an appetite and cravings perspective, which is something that's often spoken about, it also doesn't matter that much. I've got a thought experiment for you to think about if you disagree with me on that one. If this matters, we can use this in other areas. There are many cases where people have limited appetites, and there are ways we can get around this. The most common one I've heard people trial is like having just simple carbs, like 15 grams of simple carbs, like 30 to 60 minutes before you need to eat a large meal. This is for like somebody who would be like a hard gainer, somebody who struggles to like put on size. Like if they struggle to eat enough food, this could help them. You can see how this could have relevance for like malnutrition or people who are say older and they're struggling to eat enough food. You could have this like before a meal to like get them to get the full meal in. It doesn't work in that space. And it does really get you thinking at the reverse, like does this work for trying to limit like cravings and stuff like that? For diabetes, you could say this does matter, but you can then point to like how much does it matter? The walking one, huge.
Yep.
Like I've had people, there's one guy in particular, like probably in my second or third year as a dietitian, he went for a morning walk every second day after his bowl of oats. He experimented with a few things. Like he would like sometimes do quick oats, sometimes he'd do whole oats. But like I could see from his blood glucose levels every day, did he go for a walk or did he not? He even like tried to like trick me sometimes by like doing it on the third day instead of the second. And I was like, that's the day you went for a walk. So it's like, this has like some meaningful things. But then I also like to point out, like, what if you just work a regular job and after lunch you can't go for a walk, like, and you don't have diabetes? Is it worth like doing this? There's so many more behaviors that can have a bigger impact on your health overall, which is probably a big point that I'm like, I wouldn't overly focus on this. I think there are a lot of things we can do that move the needle more overall.
That's exactly what I would say. Like if we're going to focus on something to support general metabolic health, eat foods like whole grains that are paired with things like vegetables and protein. So generally across the day, you've got a pretty steady blood glucose level. We occasionally talk about having fast digesting carbs pre-workout for a specific reason. There's a reason that we do that, to get that blood glucose spike. Otherwise, these strategies are things that for the general population probably just are not that important.
Cool. We'll jump off there. So that has been episode 240 of Rapid Fire Diet Trends. It was harder than we thought to come up with stuff. I was still pretty like happy with what would come up. If anyone has ideas or things that they want us to talk about, let us know. But apart from that, as always, if you haven't left a rating and review, we would massively appreciate that.